Hello, everyone. I think we'll get started. So thank you very much for coming and welcome to the Growth Lab's development talks. My name is Ketan Ahuja. I'm a research fellow at the Growth Lab here at the Kennedy School, and I study green growth. It's my great pleasure today to welcome Amir Lebdioui, Assistant Professor in Political Economy of Development at SOAS, University of London. His talk today, Greening Economic Development, What Does It Take?, will address how governments can cope with the changing optimal pathways to economic development and address the type of joined-up policy that's needed to use decarbonization as a lever to diversify economies, leave commodity dependence traps, and increase macroeconomic resilience. Dr. Amir Lebdioui is an Algerian development economist and lecturer in political economy of development at SOAS, University of London. Before joining SOAS, Amir was based at the London School of Economics, where he led Canning House Research Forum, a research and policy engagement program on the future of trade in Latin America. His research is focused on the economic diversification of resource-dependent nations, low-carbon innovation, biodiversity-based innovation, and industrialization in the context of climate change. Amir also regularly advises governments and international institutions on industrial policy. He serves on the Advisory Council of the Natural Resource Governance Institute, as a member of the African Climate Foundation, and as a non-resident fellow of the Africa Policy Research Institute. He holds an MPhil and PhD in development studies from the University of Cambridge. Welcome to Dev Talks, Professor Lebdioui.
Thanks, Ketan, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to, thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to present at the Growth Lab and at the Kennedy School, but also to be in the place that, I'm sorry, I can only refer to as the other Cambridge, as to stay loyal to my alma mater. So, the talk today is about kind of greening economic development and different pathways to achieve that goal. Essentially, it's about the intersection between these four dimensions of development, diversification, decarbonization, and dematerialization, which actually also reflect my own research journey. Right? When I did my PhD, I was mostly working on the intersection of diversification and development in resource-dependent countries, then started to work on decarbonization, and only recently started to address the dematerialization side of things, because there is a lot of emphasis on climate change, but there are many other ecological goals, such as material pollution, plastic pollutions, degradation, which has an impact on human health and our survival as species. And those four dimensions also quite important, because very often we tend to focus on one or two, sometimes three, but they can sometimes lead to contradictory or opposite outcomes, right? So focusing on decarbonization sometimes can also increase the material footprint and therefore have negative environmental effects. As a theory, the growth movement is better than the rest at looking at the dematerialization and the material footprint, but actually fails as a development theory. And likewise, there's a lot of work on greening growth, but not really looking at the diversification of productive structures. It's not just about deploying environmental technologies in developing countries without actually understanding the shift in structural change that is needed for them to increase their resilience to climate and transition risks. The main argument of this presentation is that the conditions for economic development and macroeconomic resilience are dramatically changing as a result of both climate and transition risks. I won't go into too much details about, the processes under those risks, because I assume that, most of you are well aware of those and focus on what to do about it. But yeah, by the way, the other thing here is about what you do, because here the intellectual argument is not sufficient, right? It's very nice to say that you need all these four at the same time, but actually, how do you get there, right? There are many governments that have, an uncountable number of governments that have a green growth vision. But you know what they say, too many visions can lead to hallucinations, right? And you can count on the finger, like the actual countries that are embarking on a green transformation. Costa Rica is one of them, and not least due to the efforts of Andy as Minister of Trade recently. Here, the point I was going to focus, though, in terms of climate and transition risks, is the productive side of things, which is often overlooked. Most of the developing world is dependent on the export of commodities that are highly vulnerable to fluctuations. Think about coffee production in Colombia, Vietnam, cocoa production in Ghana, fossil fuels at risk of stranded assets, or minerals that are still at risk of technological disruption, right? If we come up with technologies that use substitute minerals. The other thing that is really important to highlight before going to the topic of today relates to the right to pollute, right? There are all these transition risks, but I think it's very important to have nuance in the narrative, because very often when we talk about these things, we send the idea that developing countries have to address climate change, right, and decarbonize. Whereas from a developing country point of view, they haven't contributed to, the atmospheric stock of greenhouse gases. And to give you an example, today, Africa represents about 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. If the entire African continent was to extract all of its known natural gas reserves, right, in the ground, its share of global emissions would increase from 3% to a mere 3.5%, which is negligible. So when talking about these things, it's important to recognize those needs to also address energy security needs, especially when seeing the reversal in energy trends in Europe. But at the same time, understanding that there is this right to pollute, the argument that I want to make is that using that right to pollute can often lead to suboptimal growth pathways, right? And basically, the model, the carbon-intensive development model that has been pursued by countries over the past century might not really be replicable or even desirable anymore, which also leads us to question the relevance of industrialization as a development model. Industry accounts for a lot of global greenhouse gas emissions, but at the same time, the point here is that industrialization actually matters as much as ever, right? It's a key ingredient of the transition to a low carbon future, but it needs to be different based on new principles of sustainability, dematerialization, durability, right, away from the programmed obsolescence. And there are a range of co-benefits and green windows of opportunities that arise from green industrialization, mostly in terms of job creation, which have much higher labor intensity than fossil fuel extraction, export market opportunities, but also innovation, right? The understanding that sustainability is the next innovation frontier. However, and this will be the first part of my presentation, those benefits that arise from global decarbonization are captured by a handful of economies in the industrialized world, which has huge implications in terms of the UN central promise of leaving no one behind. If you look at the distribution of jobs in renewable energy, and I apologize for my very poor graphic design skills, you see that a lot of them are generated in a handful of countries, right? China accounts for about half of them, but also the US, Brazil, Germany, and India. But the other thing that we see with this map is that those are not the places that are more at risk of losing fiscal revenues and jobs out of decarbonization and phasing out of fossil fuels, right? In other words, the countries that desperately need the most those green jobs. So this has a huge implication in terms of the ability of developing countries to benefit from global decarbonization. And we're not just talking about the quantity of jobs, but we're not even accounting for the differences in quality of jobs, right? The jobs that are created in Brazil, in India, they tend to be mostly low-paid, low-skilled, temporary jobs, right, in construction and maintenance of renewable energy plants or sugar plantations, whereas the jobs created in the so-called global north tend to be in manufacturing and innovation, so basically better jobs. That trend, obviously, this is kind of pulled together, but across different types of renewable energy technologies, you see slight differences. The highest concentration is with the solar energy sector, as well as the wind energy sector, whereas jobs in biofuels tend to be a bit more diffuse. That pattern is also replicated in the context of low carbon innovation, where a few countries account, basically 4 countries account for 3/4 of patents in renewable energy technologies. And this is also the case for hydrogen and fuel cells, where historically China didn't really have a big role to play, but you can see over the past year that China's share in the kind of distribution of R&D budget in hydrogen is increasing very fast. And talking about hydrogen, I want to make a little parenthesis, because very often when we hear about hydrogen, we hear about how this is a great opportunity for developing countries, right? The countries that can produce green hydrogen the most competitively, these are countries in Latin America, North Africa, Southern Africa. However, when you look at the global kind of distribution and planned trade agreements around low carbon hydrogen, you see that this is very much geared towards reproducing patterns of commodity dependency, right? Of basically producing green hydrogen in the global south and exporting it to feed into industries and green industries in the global north, especially Germany. And this relates to a point that Ricardo Hausmann has made, and I assume that most of you have already heard that, about moving towards an energy flat world, right? That now basically hydrogen means that these countries that have the conditions to produce it, it might be easier for them to actually use that hydrogen for as a domestic input into local industries. However, in terms of what we're seeing so far, we see that reproduction of commodity dependence. But by the way, this might not be a bad thing on the long term, because there's so many risks of these technological disruptions around hydrogen that it's not necessarily a bad thing that is a country in the global north that is taking more of the risks, right? At least in the short term, with the idea in the medium to long term that once the technology becomes cost competitive and globally deployed, that there'll be a chance of integrating higher segments of that value chain. In terms of export markets and manufacturing, there is a very similar story, right? 3 countries account for half of global exports of low carbon technology products. The rise of China is particularly impressive, right, over the past 20 years. And you see this across a range of low carbon technologies, right, where a few countries really dominate the market, apart from electric cars and wind energy equipment, where instead of China, it tends to be European countries, Germany, Belgium, Denmark. But by the way, this is just looking at exports. But if we were to look at manufacturing capacity, then China actually comes on top in every single low carbon technology, right? It's just because a lot of the production is domestically consumed and not exported. So this has huge implications about how we think about comparative advantage in low carbon technology products. And what we see clearly here is that a few countries that are already industrialized are the ones that are most poised to benefit from decarbonization as an industrial opportunity, which is why we really need to think about going beyond comparative advantage, in a way, think about the dynamic acquisition of comparative advantages in low carbon sectors. Thanks to the work of many development economists, right, we know that a lot of the existing comparative advantages are actually policy induced, right? There's nothing that makes Danish people better at producing wind turbines, right, than people in Africa, Latin America. So this calls for path-defying behavior. And that role of governments, right, in stimulating this acquisition of comparative advantages leads us to think about the role of the state, right, in steering green economic transformations. So in a way, they would have to behave more than just referees setting the rules, but more as head coaches, especially in a global economy where countries are competing with one another for these markets. So behaving a bit more like Zidane, right? I'm a bit biased being Algerian. And by the way, I'm really into sports metaphor to talk about economics. If you're interested, I have a published piece on what resource-dependent countries can learn from Kobe Bryant and Serena Williams. The comparison is uncanny. But obviously, even governments behaving like head coaches, right? Which also means that they don't necessarily play in the game, but they set up the strategy, the long-term vision for players to succeed. This requires long-term vision and foresight, right? So they cannot be blindsided. And this is not to single out Joe Biden. This needs to happen across the world, but it just happened to be the person that was photographed in that extremely evocative gesture. And this leads to the whole discussion about the green renaissance of industrial policy and protectionism. I don't want to go too much into the green industrial policy debate because I know that many of you are well versed into the discussion by now. But the interesting thing is really seeing how the climate agenda is providing this excuse to finally explicitly recognize the need for industrial policy, even if it hasn't disappeared, right? In countries like the US, where now it's an explicit acknowledgement, well, historically, it was more kind of called research and development, right? And so on. Once I met a policymaker from Chile, which, there's a kind of ideological story behind, but they had this kind of industrial cluster strategy, right? Picking sectors. But they were so afraid of that terminology that he told me, no, we're not choosing sectors. We're making strategic bets on global market opportunities, right? It's different. So it's interesting to see that change in the narrative and across the globe, right? Not just in the US, obviously, but China and the rise of green deals in Korea and other places. So the only thing that I really want to mention about the return of industrial policy is about what is different from standard industrial policy. And in many ways, it's not just about using the same industrial policy tools and just applying it to low carbon sectors, right? Because even the way productivity is attained is a bit different. It's not just about the logic of producing more to increase productivity and value addition, but there's a high emphasis now on resource efficiency, but also so-called environmental upgrading as a way to add value, right? Through product differentiation, diversification as well through circular economy measures, which means that you can diversify to different industries. The challenge of it's not just decarbonization, but also dematerialization. The carbon footprint does matter a lot. And sustainability is dynamic across time and space. So for example, you can reduce the material footprint by using more water to clean goods, but in water intensive, water scarce areas, obviously that's not necessarily sustainable. And the other thing is, for green industrial policy, there's a much higher level of coordination that is needed with other policy dimensions and actors compared to standard industrial policy, particularly with the role of ministries of energy and environment. With standard industrial policy, this was the realm of the powerful Ministry of International Trade and Industry, right? From Japan to Korea and many other places. But nowadays, and you can see it in practice in countries that are trying to do green industrial policy, you cannot do that without aligning your agenda with the Ministry of Energy, right? With the Ministry of Environment, and increasingly with the ministries of education and so on, because of the need for green skills. Which leads me to present this joined up market shaping green policy approach. That's a mouthful. But the idea here is that industrial policy is really at the core of many other types of policy. And that coordination is absolutely necessary for the success of green industrial policy. And that includes coordination with fiscal policies, especially because green industries require long-term investments, right? And sometimes higher risks. Energy policy, because obviously, you can't really promote the green industries without ensuring that your energy matrix is green. Environmental policy, which is often also used as a demand side, policy, right? With environmental regulation forcing firms or consumers to adopt different technologies and sometimes providing opportunities to reach economies of scale, like LED lighting, for example, in Europe, right? Where the phasing out of incandescent light bulbs enabled LED lighting to finally become cost competitive. Skills and knowledge policy, this is in line with the Gershon-Cronian argument of the need of skilled human capital, right? To use labor in factories as opposed to agriculture, and the importance of green skills, but also labor market policies to ensure that the people that are most vulnerable because of global decarbonization can also benefit from reskilling programs to access green jobs. The benefit of this joined-up approach, beyond just fostering green industrialization, is also the ability to address transversal challenges. The first one, I'll just mention two. The first one is the issue of the cost of capital for renewable energy in developing countries, which is still one of the biggest hurdle for green industrialization, right, by extension. Because if you can't really invest in renewables, then you basically, can't really promote the decarbonization of manufacturing activities or services. And this is a bit of a paradox, right? Because developing countries tend to have significant labor, land, construction cost advantages, but the renewable energy projects cost more there than in Europe or North America. And this has to do a lot with the fact that renewable energy projects require much more upfront capital than fossil fuels. And this is also related to the cost of debt, because a lot of these projects are financed by debt. And that means that developing countries, where usually interest rates are much higher. And for example, in India, the cost in terms of debt can add about 32% to the cost of utility-scale wind and solar PV projects, right? And this obviously, in the same across the African continent, leads to distortions and lock-in into carbon-intensive economic pathways. And by the way, just to illustrate this argument, last year was a record year for renewable energy investments worldwide, right? But if you look at the data in terms of renewable energy investment per capita, you see that for North America, it's about $170 per capita. Guess what is the value for Sub-Saharan Africa? Take a guess. It's actually $1, which is ridiculously low when you put those things into that figure, right? So it's very clear there is a big hurdle for expanding renewables in the developing world. In terms of joint-up policy approach and trying to reduce it, there are policy tools, right, to try to address the solution. That goes from fiscal incentives to lower the upfront cost of green projects, which have varying cost competitiveness depending on the local context. Capacity building, provision of technical support or streamlining of bureaucratic procedures to increase competitiveness, risk sharing mechanisms to give investors a more stable and predictable revenue stream. But those three solutions still, and the policy tools that they include, they still have limited effectiveness if you don't address the cost of debt, right? Especially in countries that rely on debt to finance those projects, which is why a long-term solution needs to be about reducing the cost of external borrowing. This can be done in various ways. For example, in countries where a lot of the cost of capital derives from currency conversion risks, indexing renewable energy tariffs to foreign currency can eliminate those risks, those currency hedging costs. Green bonds, but this is again not a debate, right? Whether they're effective or not, whether there is an existence of so-called greenium, which is the green premium for green bonds. But across the board, there seems to be a greenium, even though it kind of its size or scale diverge. And lending with concessional terms from multilateral development banks. But there, really, climate financing is currently not up to the task, right, and needs to expand. So just to give you an example from data that recently heard about, and that really shocked me, the share of the capital base of the World Bank, which donor countries have actually paid and that is available for lending to developing countries, is about 6%, right, of what donor countries are supposed to give the World Bank, right? So in those contexts, it's not just about expanding, there's a more structural issue to address. The Bridgetown initiative put forward by Mia Motley is something we can discuss afterwards, whether this can help address this issue. In terms of climate finance contribution, well, this country is the one that is paying the least its fair share, right, of the $100 billion promised as part of the Copenhagen COP. The US is currently missing about $40 billion, right, in climate financing. The second challenge I wanted to address is ensuring that those green economic transformations are also socially inclusive, right? Because that might not be the case, which is why we can't really romanticize the impact that decarbonization can have on inequality, not only between countries, but also within countries. And when industrial policy tools are not coordinated with social inclusion and education policies, economic transformation, industrialization can exacerbate inequalities. And the case of Costa Rica is a case in point. And these are discussions that we also had with Andy, where Costa Rica has had a very successful export sophistication and industrialization process, right? Leading to considerable developmental benefits. However, a lot of those jobs, a lot of this process created jobs for already existing skilled labor, right? Which means that the differential for wages between skilled labor and unskilled labor actually increased. Even at the regional area, right? A lot of the jobs were created in the center of the country, in San Jose, but in rural areas or in the coast, they didn't really benefit from this boom. And similar things can happen with green industrialization, which is why it's extremely important to coordinate industrial, social skills, and labor market policies to address those skill matches. And this is not just in terms of income levels, also the sectoral dimension matters, right? To make sure that the people that are at risk of losing their jobs can also benefit from green skills programs. And this is extremely important as well to reduce the popular resistance to low carbon transitions, right? And ensure that even if you move more slowly, then at least you ensure longevity of this process. But also across gender lines, right? We know that a lot more women are employed in renewables than in fossil fuels, but that doesn't mean that this process will still be equalizing, right? Which means that interventions are key to reduce the gender gap. Another thing is adding a few further challenges for latecomers. It's important not to romanticize the extent to which every country can actually embark on this industrialization path, even if they have the right policy tools, because risks and challenges exist. The first one is when we talk about green industrial policy, the evidence that exists in the literature, the examples that are used, very often it's especially including in the developing world, China, Brazil, India, right? But those three countries have a huge domestic market size. And very often their green industrial policy relied heavily on demand side policies, right? But if you're Togo or Peru or Guatemala, I mean, you can't use a lot of these tools, right? Because the domestic market size cannot be replicated. There is also the issue of path dependence of innovation. Even in the developing world, countries that really managed to develop very successful, competitive green industries, like Brazil with the wind turbine sector, it heavily relied, and that's in Katie Husser's book, heavily relied on pre-existing capabilities in aerospace engineering, because the technology for wind turbines is actually very similar to the technology for helicopters and aerospace, which I guess links a bit to some of the work you might be doing here at the Growth Lab. And even in China and Malaysia, which are the two largest exporters of solar cells, is heavily relied on pre-existing electronics capabilities. Third, a lot of the green industries or green products are already extremely, there's a lot of competition, right? Especially solar panels. And actually, if you look at green industrial policy tools across the African continent, you see that there is an over-reliance on local content requirements in solar and wind, right? This is arguably the worst type of green industrial policy you could do, because not only you'll never be able to compete with China in terms of exporting those products, but also what happens very often is that it's just increasing the levelized cost of energy at the end, which means that the downstream industries that could use cheap energy, right, for more competitive decarbonized manufacturing services becomes higher. And in terms of, a lot relies on local content policy tools that were successfully used in fossil fuels and reapplied on this. The book by Tony Addison, Extract Industries, is quite interesting. And lastly, technological uncertainty, right? More than with standard industrialization, the pace of technological uncertainty is moving extremely fast, right? And you see it even with from concentrated solar power, which was Morocco's strategy, to PV, right? A lot of technology is already obsolete. So keeping up to date is extremely difficult, and you need very strong technological foresight capabilities. And I mean, the technological disruption is something, is well illustrated by Dan and his work in this area, showing that those things can move extremely fast. So because of all these risks, why not remain a consumer of low carbon technologies, right? Stay conservative, given the risk associated with green industrial policies, especially in countries that have very little related productive capabilities. And the thing to remember here is the risk of doing nothing, right, and keeping the status quo, as showed earlier, is much higher than trying to integrate low carbon value chains, right? Because you're essentially heading straight into a wall. And the other important thing to remember is that there are different ways in which nations can address and tackle green economic transformation plans based on their starting points and capabilities, which leads me to present a few research outputs and policy projects that I've been doing to show that, kind of different pathways exist based on your different starting points, and that it's not all about manufacturing, right? And I think this is something that we learn a lot from the work of Carlota Perez, who for decades have been really showing that a lot of the technological sophistication upgrading can occur in resource sectors and outside of manufacturing. So the four projects that I wanted to present, especially in the spirit of showing those different pathways, showing those different starting points. The first one is the difficult context of fossil fuel producers, right? Where the work that I've been doing was a lot about repurposing existing capabilities in fossil fuel extraction towards hydrogen and renewable supply chains, with a specific application to the context of Oman. Second one about biodiverse, for biodiverse nations. If you're a biodiverse nation, right, you're not going to destroy your biodiversity to put solar plants. That is not sustainable, right? So, and it's a big issue for those nations because very often the way conservation and development have been, the interplay between the two has been either in favor of resource use and extraction, or things like ecotourism, which don't really offer a really viable path to long-term upgrading. So here I'll present some work on biodiversity-based innovation, especially the concept of biomimicry and how that can help some of these biodiverse nations leap towards innovation activities. The third one, if there's time, is the concept of the altitude economy in Bhutan. This is work done with 3 collaborators, Tony Addison, Pavel Bilek, and Azman Mokhtar, where for the government of Bhutan and the World Bank, we had to think of a new diversification strategy, but this is a country that is small, landlocked, mountainous, so you can't really do the traditional stuff that you do in a country that is large and has a huge domestic market size. And lastly, for the Guatemalas, Togos, Benins of this world, countries that have a very small domestic market size, it's important to think about regional supply chain coordination. Here I'll present the work I've been doing on the idea of a Latin American Green Deal, right? Fostering synergies and complementarities across the continent. So the first one on fossil fuel exporting countries. Very often when you think about transition from oil and gas to renewables, we think about the fiscal linkage, right? How oil and gas companies or fossil fuel producers invest their money in renewable energy sector. But there's actually a wide range of transversal capabilities embedded in oil and gas production that could be repurposed, right, towards renewable energy supply chains and low carbon, low emissions hydrogen, including infrastructure, products, knowledge, technological and organization skills. So this is basically about exploiting a dormant comparative advantage in fossil fuel streaks to seize green windows of opportunities. And this is also a way to promote macroeconomic resilience, because suppliers that have those transversal capabilities can then seek market opportunities outside of oil and gas, especially when commodity prices go down, right? And this is something that suppliers in Malaysia, for example, have done. When commodity prices go down, right, they use those transversal skills in fluid engineering and so on to sell their services in other markets like railway engineering and so on. This study was based on a survey and was funded by the International Energy Agency. And we're able to kind of get surveys of the major oil and gas companies that were already transitioning and basically ask them what kind of skills were they repurposing from oil and gas operations to renewables, and what kind of skills they couldn't repurpose and they had to hire kind of new profiles, right? And what was their background? And interesting insights emerged, right, in terms of the great disparity of transversality in capabilities, right? Chemical and temperature and fluids engineering are highly transversal, right? It can really help you produce hydrogen, so you don't start from scratch. But obviously, if you're in a drilling or a subsurface engineer, or if you do enhanced oil recovery, those skills are not really needed. And the technology and skills are not really needed in renewable energies, right? And this has great implications when you think again about a joint policy approach, because in terms of skills, right? And then the application was done for the Sultanate of Oman. Then the universities also have to adapt the kind of skills that they're promoting, right? And adjust to this transversality. And interesting to mention is at the fiscal level, now doing kind of executive workshops for the Central Bank of Oman to kind of, have a more proactive role in terms of allocating more capital towards priority sectors and renewables And that's also links to macroeconomic resilience, right? So this is a kind of link between monetary, fiscal policies, and industrial policies. And by the way, the role of sovereign wealth funds is also particularly important. Traditionally, they haven't had this role, right, of supporting transition, but with Tony Addison, we also do work on sovereign wealth funds in Africa in terms of how they can be a lever to promote industrial development, but also resilience to transition and climate risks. The second project, and this is probably my favorite, is about biodiversity-based innovation. So I'd like to ask you, what do you see in this bird in terms of what's its value for economic development? Perhaps some of you that have an engineering background might see it more than others. This is a kingfisher. What is special about this bird?
It's rare and exclusive.
Potentially one way to generate value, right? The beauty of this bird, but there's another kind of key source of value.
Maintaining the ecological balance, he must do something.
Maybe, but it's not quite the thing. I think someone said it. The beak, right? So the engineers amongst you might appreciate the particular aerodynamic shape of the kingfisher's beak. And this is actually was one way in which Japanese engineers managed to solve an issue for Japanese bullet trains, right? By mimicking the shape of this beak, and they were able to resolve an issue with sound when the bullet trains were coming out of tunnels. And the examples are vast, right? If we had 3 hours, I could go on and talk about this process. And actually, Dan is doing amazing things with artificial leaves, right, in biomimicry, which I had a chance to talk about it yesterday. But this is a fascinating field. Basically, in a nutshell, the idea there is that biodiversity, besides the ecological value, which of course matters, also has this value as a source of information for innovation, right? And not just in terms of the traditional extraction of genetic materials for pharmaceuticals, cosmetic, but also in terms of imitation, right? Of either processes, form, or ecosystems. This field is booming in terms of impacts on innovation, patents, research, and even in terms of estimated job creation. And the interesting thing is that where is the lion's share of biodiversity in the world? Well, the remaining biodiversity is mostly in developing countries, right? But a lot of this value, which is currently partly exploited, is actually generated in global north countries, right? Where there are the ecosystem firms and skills to get this innovation value from biomimicry. Throughout my research, I met fantastic researchers across Latin America doing amazing things in terms of finding worms that secretes hydrogel that could kind of, stronger than glue when it dries. It could replace stitches and many other efforts. But there's still a limit to how much those things can be achieved and scaled up, mostly because of a lack of a joint up approach, right? And the lack of national innovation ecosystems around biodiversity. Sorry, the slide is in Spanish, but the idea there is really to think about this process in a holistic way that involves different actors from the state, universities, research centers, but also local communities that are actually involved in maintaining that biodiversity, right? Because essentially they're maintaining that bank of ideas for innovation. And think about the joint up approach. Of course, all of those matter, but one example, particularly for biomimicry, is the context of skills and knowledge policy. Because if you want to do biomimicry, you cannot just have biological skills. You need a strategic mix of biology, engineering, design, and chemistry, right? Which are not programs that the standard curriculum provides, which is why some countries are starting, especially in Europe and North America, university courses kind of bringing together different disciplines at the same time. The third one is the context of Bhutan, as I mentioned earlier. So small, landlocked, mountainous, high transaction cost economy, heavily dependent on hydropower. So here what we did with my colleagues is kind of looking at different criteria and kind of coming up with what kind of solutions are most viable in the Bhutanese context. And come up with the idea of the altitude economy, right, based on kind of ease of doing those projects and return on spillovers, with the idea that, for countries like Bhutan, an emphasis on virtual, tradable, energy-intensive services could circumvent the high trade costs associated with traditional merchandise exports. Things like data centers, clouding services. If you want to go with a more ambitious, the high peak is kind of value-added IT services and a larger green entrepreneurial ecosystem, right, around sustainability. So in a way, Bhutan could become the alternative green Davos, more sustainable, more accessible. But foothills, low-hanging fruits, which particularly include international payments for ecological services, because basically Bhutan is one of the first carbon negative countries in the world, right? It's doing the world a favor, but it's not getting compensation for it. So this could be a low-hanging fruit, although it requires coordination, bilateral efforts, and so on. And here, the example I wanted to drive in terms of the joint up policy approach is labor market, because in Bhutan, a lot of the poverty and employment is for the youth, that low-skilled and suffers from alcoholism, amongst many other issues. So here, really making sure that this process is not exacerbating inequalities is extremely important. And the last, I'll just skip that, it's on the institutional level. The last project is the project of a Latin American Green Deal, right? And here, really, the idea is that many Latin American countries cannot just, with the exception of Brazil, maybe, cannot really embark on a serious green economic transformation if they do it on their own without regional coordination in integration. Right? There are complementary strengths from critical minerals abundance, from Chile, Peru, Cuba, and many other places. It's actually complementary minerals dispersed across the region to manufacturing capacity in countries like Brazil and Costa Rica, low-cost renewable energy potential in Chile, Mexico, Paraguay, and proximity to important trade routes like in Panama. Right? All these strengths could be fostered towards the development of efficient regional industrial ecosystems around low carbon technologies. And one of the most shocking examples is wind turbines, right? This is something where Latin America has all the minerals to do, existing capacity and technology to do it in Brazil, and has the largest demand for wind turbines, in the world, right? But a lot of these raw materials are exported to mostly China as raw materials and re-imported. And the cost of transporting or shipping wind turbines is extremely high, right? Economically and ecologically, because you have to ship these massive things across the globe. And by the way, 98% of balsa wood, which goes into the blades of wind turbines, is produced in Ecuador, right, globally. So this really shows about the kind of things that could be achieved with regional coordination and missed opportunities by not collaborating. And the impact would be across different types of sectors by this, not just about industrial development. It also includes agriculture, biodiversity protection, especially for assets that cut across borders like the Amazon. This is where there's been a lot of interesting efforts already. Climate smart mining, but also kind of clean energy, right? If you have coordinated renewable energy deployment policies to integrate regional grids and transmission systems, and actually also enables greater energy supply security, similarly to the Nordic model of the Nord Pool, where actually when you have less sun or less wind, you have alternative energy sources from other countries that pick up, right? And you have a more stable grid. But obviously, there are policy challenges, a lot of challenges, right? Financial ones, but I don't think they're the most important because those things are, in the end of the investment. The most important ones is at the political level, right? The kind of coordination that you need to make that happen. And ideological divergences, rivalries, geopolitical positioning, those things have historically hindered market integration and can make consensus difficult to reach. But, as Antonio Gramsci said, you need to have pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. And cooperation is already existing in some formats, especially on climate issues. The new pink tide offers opportunities for alignment, but there are still some challenges, right? In the African context, there are also similar discussions about regional coordination for green industrial policy. There's another challenge, which is the big disparity in capabilities amongst countries, which means that a lot of countries think that this kind of integration means that the South Africa, the Egypt, Nigeria would really take off, and for the other ones, it won't really make a difference. So a few takeaways. Decarbonization brings about both challenges and opportunities for economic catch-up, right? And so far, there are huge implications for the central promise of the UN Sustainable Development Goals of leaving no one behind. There are different starting points and pathways, right? Which also calls for creativity. So the process of mimicking what countries do in terms of development and industrial development and green development is not always, doesn't really pay off always, especially because of the fallacy of composition. If everybody tries to do the same thing, maybe the strategy is not viable anymore, right? Because you can't have that many. Everybody wants to be a regional hub for hydrogen, by the way. I mean, there's a limit to how many hubs there can be by definition. There are political constraints, right, in terms of the coalition public opinion that is needed. And here it's really important to think about those things in economic terms, right? It's job creation. And the interesting thing with the Biden administration Inflation Reduction Act is that even though this is green industrial policy, I don't think that ecological reasons are mentioned at all, right? For obvious reasons, this idea is really to get some buy-in from different communities that really want to see benefits in terms of jobs. And interestingly, at the political level, a lot of the states where investments are happening are states that tend to be dominated by the Republican Party, right? So this is also a way to link it with political purposes. Lastly, there's a limit to what can be done without a real reform of the international financial and trading systems, right? We mentioned the financial systems in terms of the terrible state of climate financing, and even the type of climate financing is not the right one, right? Very often, it's really about financing to deploy technologies produced in the global north, right? I have a friend in government in a Latin American country saying that for hydrogen, a lot of the financing comes with active negotiation to keep the manufacturing and job in the global north, right? And the trade system as well. WTO is today in a very awkward position, right, in terms of the rise of green industrial protection policy and protectionism. So the system is not really fit for purpose in terms of achieving those goals. I want to end with this quote from Charles Darwin. It's not the most intellectual of the species that survive, right? Which is perhaps a useful thing to say, since you're the best and brightest. It's not the strongest that survive, it's the species that survive. The species that survives are the ones that is able to best adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which it finds itself, right? That applies to economics. That also applies to economists in terms of adapting to the challenges that we face today in terms of promoting economic development. Thank you all for your attention. I'm just putting some of my outputs here in case you're interested. Yeah,